Beneath layers of vitrified soil on a former colony world, archaeologists recovered a trench line interrupted by fragments of yellowed banners and oxidized servo-skull fragments stamped with a now obscure sigil. An astropathic transcript sealed and dated in Imperial numerals was unearthed from a collapsed communications pit. The handwriting contained the terse cadence of a forward observer who'd seen whole fleets appear on a world's horizon like a second dawn. Eyewitness reports passed down through municipal record archives on worlds reclaimed during the same era describe similar scenes: entire star systems reintroduced to one another, ports reopened to traffic after generations of silence, and the slow, deliberate stitching together of trade routes that had once been thought lost. These material residues and first-person accounts converge on a single, defining program of expansion and reunification, frequently referenced in official and unofficial records: the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade emerges in the surviving documentary record as a managed, instrumented campaign rather than a chaotic outbreak of conquest. It has a discernible origin in the policy choices of a central authority that sought to reconstitute dispersed human polity following a prolonged period of regression and isolation. Contemporary administrative dispatches and recovered logistics manifests emphasize a dual objective: to secure human worlds from alien domination or internecine collapse, and to bring those worlds into an integrated structure of governance and resource exchange. That structure combined military projection with bureaucratic assimilation, and it framed the overall enterprise as a civilizational restoration rather than a simple war of annexation. Chronology within the archival corpus places the beginning of the Crusade roughly in the late years of the 30th millennium and extending into the early years of the 31st millennium. Most compiled chronologies approximate the campaign's span from about the 798th year of the 30th millennium to approximately the 5th year of the 31st millennium, yielding an operational duration on the order of 200 Terran years. This temporal measurement is repeated across multiple post-Crusade compendia and is treated as a working baseline for subsequent historical analysis of the era that follows. The program's conception cannot be understood without reference to the technological and psychic conditions that preceded it. For reasons recorded in Mechanicus exegesis and in recovered treatises from Terra's scientific ateliers, large regions of the galaxy had been rendered effectively inaccessible by unstable passages through the immaterial medium used for faster-than-light travel. When those warp conditions abated in particular sectors, corridors reopened and made practical the movement of large military and logistical fleets. The re-establishment of reliable interstellar transit is thus a proximate enabling factor for the broader campaign. Without it, the scale of coordinated reconnection recorded in the manifest would have been impossible. Contemporary administrative notes confer special status upon several institutional innovations that directly supported the Crusade's objectives. Among these, the systematic formation of specialized navigational telepathic networks and dedicated signal corps appears repeatedly. Technical briefings recovered from early campaign depots reference the organization of astral telegraph services and the construction of a dedicated guiding beacon intended to sustain long-range fleet movements. Operational summaries attribute improved synchronization of expeditionary fleets to these advances in communications and to the cooperation between the Central Authority's planners and the adept engineers of the Mars-based Forge cities. The campaign's human resources present a mixture of scale and specialization that the recovered demographic records only partially capture. Large swathes of the civilian population on reclaimed worlds are described in municipal ledgers as numbering in the hundreds of millions to billions per planet, with heavy regional variants tied to the world's ecology and industrial capacity. Imperial muster rolls and Legion support registries indicate that the transstellar military forces arrayed for the Crusade combined several distinct components: genetically modified assault cadres, mechanized infantry drawn from planetary levies, naval expeditionary elements, and auxiliary labor contingents tasked with reconstruction and garrison maintenance. Spaceborne Legion rosters vary by source but are consistently described as formations of enhanced humanoid warriors. supplemented by far larger numbers of regular human troops and support staff. When analysis turns to individual physical parameters within the military cohort, the records make a clear distinction between the enhanced warrior cadres and ordinary human recruits. Medical inventories and gene seed custody logs associated with the augmented warriors' record average standing heights and mass ranges that exceed those of baseline human populations by factors significant enough to alter equipment design and deployment doctrine. Power armor schematics from forward depots specify suits calibrated for operators whose unarmored stature commonly exceeded 2 meters in height and whose combat-ready mass reached into the multiple hundreds of kilograms once augmented physiology and implanted systems were accounted for. These engineering artifacts imply a deliberate design envelope comprising taller, heavier, and more resilient soldiers than those sustained by standard planetary militias, and the logistics manifests show that the supply chains for this cohort require distinct provisions and longer maintenance cycles. The recruitment mechanisms for these augmented warriors are described with bureaucratic precision in recovered orders. Candidate selection combined genealogical sampling, targeted conscription on key population centres, and strategic rearing in dedicated facilities. Early recruitment directives reference an experimental phase in which prototype combat units were raised and tested in confined theatres to validate the integration of genetic material, cybernetic augmentation, and doctrinal training. Successful protocols from these tests were then standardized and disseminated across recruitment centers, producing a relatively uniform class of specialized soldiers whose presence in campaign rosters is a recurring motif in battlefield reports. Distinctive traits recorded for these elite forces extend beyond mere measurements. Medical field reports and veteran testimonies note the presence of implanted organs, accelerated reflex conditioning, and partially automated neural interfaces intended to coordinate battlefield tasks. These features are described as not merely biological enhancements, but integrated modifications that bound physiology to purpose-designed war gear and tactics. Writings from logistics officers emphasize that the integration of man and machine shaped not only individual performance, but also unit cohesion, since shared modifications produced comparable endurance profiles and synchronized decision-making under duress. Civilian life on worlds newly integrated under the Crusade's administrative umbrella exhibits a mix of continuity and rapid alteration. Municipal records detail the persistence of local cultural practices while also recording the imposition of standardized legal codes, corollary tax structures, and conscription guidelines intended to align planetary economies with interstellar provisioning requirements. Economic manifests from reclamation nodes show accelerated shifts in labor allocation toward raw material extraction, ship repair, and construction of way stations designed to support the long-term movement of fleets. Social historians who examined these records point to an often stressful transition in which local elites were co-opted into the imperial bureaucracy and traditional civic institutions were cast to serve broader logistical imperatives. Military roles occupied by civilian populations also changed in measured ways. Militia responsibilities shifted from localized defense to standardized garrison duties, and labor pools were frequently reconstituted into manpower reserves that could be mobilized for orbital transport, repair yards, and infrastructure projects supporting forward operations. Documents from administrative councils assigned explicit quotas for shipbuilding materials and labor hours, and where possible, local industries were repurposed to produce components compatible with the broader supply networks of the Crusade. These logistical reorientations appear in the same tranche of recovered records that enumerate the material cost of maintaining expeditionary fleets and sustaining protracted projection of force. Lifestyle among the augmented military class is visible in personal logs and supply requisitions recovered from forward outposts. Rations and maintenance packages list high-calorie nutrient blends, specialized stimulants for extended operations, and tailored medical regimens to support implanted systems. Personal diaries, when present in the archaeological record, emphasize ritual practices tied to unit identity, efficient maintenance routines, and a professional ethos oriented toward operational readiness rather than ceremonial display. These documents portray a cohort whose daily rhythms were governed by training cycles, equipment checks, and the constant rotation of deployment and refit rather than by the domestic patterns that shaped planetary civilian life. The early purpose of the campaign, as recorded in strategic communiques, blends ideological language with pragmatic directives. At the programmatic level, planning documents invoke the restoration of human knowledge, the elimination of threats to human habitability, and the integration of dispersed populations into a centralized system of governance. Operationally, directives prioritize the establishment of secure logistics nodes, the suppression of hostile alien presence where encountered, and the opening of routes for trade and communication. Analysis of campaign directives suggests that the ideological rhetoric served to legitimize the logistical imperatives that would underpin a functional interstellar polity. The material culture of the Crusade era reflects a hybridization of old and new engineering practices. Recovered manufacturing plates and patent fragments indicate that venerable forge techniques were adapted to produce components at planetary scale, while novel propulsion and energy systems were tested on a theatre-by-theatre basis. Vessel construction manifests reveal a modularity intended to keep ships in operation through fleet rotation and to minimize the downtime of critical hull classes. Technical correspondence between project engineers and field commanders records frequent iterative refinement, indicative of a campaign that learned and adapted its industrial processes as it extended its reach. Survivor testimony preserved in civic repositories contains repeated references to a central figure whose policies and strategic vision shaped the campaign's outlook. These accounts describe the leader as instrumental in assembling the administrative and military instruments that executed the program, as the architect of long-term projects meant to secure communication and control across vast distances. Scholarly syntheses of primary records concur that this leadership combined visible command on the field with prolonged periods of directed work on secretive projects of statecraft carried out from the home world. The dual posture of public command and private undertaking is a recurring explanatory theme in later analyses of the Crusade's final decades. Field archaeology also uncovers evidence of the campaign's apex in the form of victory monuments and administrative tracts commemorating large-scale operations. Triumphal inscriptions and parade grounds recorded in engineering logs align with accounts of decisive engagements that temporarily concentrated the campaign's resources and showcased its logistical capacity. At least one well-documented victory is repeatedly singled out in the records for its symbolic and operational significance. The aftermath of that victory includes an extensive parade and a formal reallocation of command authority that altered the command relationships of expeditionary forces. The ceremonial records and subsequent dispatches from that period mark a watershed in which overall strategic leadership shifted in a way that would have profound implications for the campaign's subsequent trajectory. In the fragments recovered from battlefields and the husks of depots, the interplay of myth and bureaucratic reality is tangible. Public proclamations cast the program as a dawn for a scattered humanity, while logistics manifests and repair logs trace the sober mechanics that sustained repeated deployments across thousands of systems. Where myth and procedure intersected, administrative actors appear to have exploited symbolic language to bind newly integrated populations to the campaign's practical aims. The record that survives thus presents the Great Crusade as both a program of grand narrative and a sustained exercise in industrialized governance. Finally, the material and testimonial record that defines the Crusade's origins and early purpose leaves a consistent impression. This was an era of deliberate reconstruction, executed through a combination of concentrated military capability, specialized human augmentation, systemic logistical engineering, and ideological framing designed to integrate dispersed human polities. Finally, the material and testimonial record that defines the Crusade's origins and early purpose leaves a consistent impression. This was an era of deliberate reconstruction, executed through a combination of concentrated military capability, specialized human augmentation, systemic logistical engineering, and ideological framing designed to integrate dispersed human polities. The archaeological traces, eyewitness registers, and administrative codices align sufficiently to reconstruct a coherent portrait of a coordinated effort to reunite humanity under a centralized program of reclamation, stabilization, and expansion. Subsequent parts of this study will examine the specific instruments of war, the technical systems that enabled projection, and the individual actors whose decisions shaped the campaign's course. Recovered fragments from forward operating depots offer a layered view of the technology and equipment that characterized the Great Crusade. Warp transit beacons, navigation matrices, and telepathic communication hubs are consistently present in expeditionary site records. The construction of these systems was undertaken by combined teams of Mars-forged artisans and field engineers. Each beacon was designed as a planetary-scale transmission array, drawing upon deep core reactors to project guidance signals across light years. Technical reports emphasized their redundancy and defensive measures. Shield generators and orbital picket forces ensured the nodes remained functional against both environmental hazards and hostile interference. These systems underpinned the ability of fleets to maintain synchronized advances across multiple theaters, creating the infrastructural backbone for the entire campaign. The weapons fielded during the Crusade reflect both the technological inheritance of earlier Terran warfare and the innovations refined during the campaign's iterative cycles. The augmented warrior cadres were equipped with personal arms that appear repeatedly in the archaeological record, mass-reactive bolters designed to deliver self-propelled shells that detonated upon penetration, chain blades utilizing high-torque drive mechanisms to shear through armor, and plasma discharge sidearms drawing from compact fusion cells. Weapon logs specify calibers, fuel sources, and maintenance schedules, indicating a culture of rigorous sustainment. For example, bolter magazines required meticulous machining tolerances, and ammunition found in storage caches shows serial codes matching thousands of rounds back to specific forges. The precision of these records illustrates the logistical care with which expeditionary forces were supplied. Heavy weapons and support systems demonstrate the scaling of destructive force to different combat environments. Las weapons of varying aperture size appear across supply inventories, ranging from infantry-held rifles powered by portable packs to tripod-mounted cannons drawing from vehicle-mounted reactors. Energy calibration manuals preserved in Mechanicus archives describe safe output thresholds to prevent operator injury while maintaining destructive effectiveness against hardened targets. Plasma weapons, although noted for their devastating yield, are also associated with higher rates of maintenance incidents. Recovered field notes list entire squads lost due to unstable plasma containment, underscoring both the weapon's utility and its inherent danger. Where plasma was employed effectively, records attribute it to experienced operators with extensive training in containment procedures. Vehicles developed during the Crusade mirror the escalating scale of battlefield requirements. Tracked transports capable of atmospheric entry and armoured advance appear in recovered manifests under standardized classes. The Rhino pattern transport, often described in technical archives of the era, represents a ubiquitous model, compact, modular, and suited for rapid deployment of infantry. Larger constructs such as the Land Raider were fitted with reinforced armour plating several times thicker than their smaller counterparts, housing both heavy weapon emplacements and transport bays for elite troops. Naval records describe Titans as towering bipedal war machines, categorized not only as vehicles but as strategic assets. These god engines, built and maintained by the Titan legions of Mars, stood dozens of meters tall and carried ordnance capable of altering entire battlefronts. Their deployment logs suggest careful allocation. They were dispatched sparingly, often to overwhelm entrenched resistance or to decisively close protracted sieges. Tools and auxiliary gear form a quieter but equally significant aspect of the Crusade's technological culture. Portable Auspex scanners, Vox communication devices, and servo automata for engineering support are listed in recovered requisition orders. Auspex devices, essentially compact sensor arrays, were used to detect hidden structures or subterranean movement, and were a common sight in campaign depots. Servo-automata served as multi-purpose labour units, executing tasks from munitions loading to field surgery under Mechanicus supervision. Recovered designs highlight modular appendages and cognitive engines restricted to programmed routines, avoiding autonomy beyond their defined functions. The presence of these tools reduced human labour burdens and accelerated the pace of both construction and warfare. The social structure sustaining the Crusade was not incidental but deliberately stratified. At its apex stood the central figure whose role was both commander and architect of the campaign. Below this supreme authority operated the Primarchs, a cadre of gene-forged leaders assigned to command the augmented warrior legions. Each Primarch was described in administrative reports as embodying both symbolic and operational significance, representing the ideals of their assigned legions while exercising independent command judgment. The legions under their command are consistently referenced as the decisive instruments of the Crusade, acting as shock forces, planetary governors during transition periods, and exemplars of martial order. Beneath the Primarchs, the enhanced warrior legions displayed their own hierarchical organization. Command structures divided into companies, squads, and specialist detachments, each with designated officers and logistical staff. Medical officers, artificers, and librarians, responsible for psychic operations and knowledge preservation, feature prominently in Legion records. The existence of these specialized roles reveals the legions not merely as blunt instruments of force, but as complex military societies with divisions of labor and evolving traditions. Parallel to them, the Imperial Army, composed of vast numbers of baseline human soldiers, provided mass, manpower, and garrisons, ensuring that worlds once conquered remained integrated into the administrative framework. Leadership outside the battlefield lay in a combination of military governors and administrative councils. Recovered charters describe the appointment of planetary governors tasked with integrating worlds into the wider polity. These governors often came from local elites co-opted into imperial service, balanced by oversight from central bureaucrats to prevent divergence from the Crusade's objectives. Administrative coordination with the Adeptus Mechanicus is also repeatedly evident, as the Mechanicus not only maintained and constructed much of the campaign's technology, but also negotiated its own autonomy within the expanding empire. This symbiotic relationship, military power paired with technological stewardship, formed the dual spine of the Crusade's governance. The values documented in Crusade-era inscriptions, orders and declarations orbit around unity, expansion, and the restoration of human supremacy across the stars. Proclamations stress the elimination of division, the reclamation of knowledge, and the pursuit of a universal human destiny. At the same time, internal orders highlight pragmatism. Supply quotas, recruitment rates, and campaign timetables dominate the preserved documentary record. The contrast between rhetorical ideals and bureaucratic execution suggests a value system that fused aspirational narrative with methodical, disciplined practice. For the legions, martial excellence and loyalty to command appear as central virtues, reinforced by ritualized oaths and encoded into legion culture. For civilian populations, obedience, productivity, and integration into the imperial system were the expected contributions, framed as participation in a greater collective destiny. When cross-referenced, the technological, organizational, and ideological aspects of the Crusade form an interlocking system. Tools and weapons were not isolated artifacts, but instruments embedded in a social structure that valued discipline and central control. Vehicles were not merely machines, but strategic assets deployed within hierarchies of command. The leadership system reinforced values that legitimized both conquest and assimilation. This synergy between technology, social organization, and ideological framing is what allowed the Crusade to sustain momentum across 2 centuries of expansion, shaping not only the material record but also the conceptual legacy that endures in the preserved histories of the period. Archaeological records and collated administrative archives preserve fragments of testimony regarding the prominent figures and forces that shaped the Great Crusade. While much of the documentation is filtered through commemorative inscriptions or post-Crusade codices, it is possible to reconstruct a clear pattern of celebrated leadership, distinctive units, and the imposing machines that became synonymous with the era. Recovered triumphal stelae from key victory sites often depict a central authority figure accompanied by towering warrior captains, their names engraved alongside campaigns they led. Among these, the Primarchs stand out as the most frequently referenced, appearing in both battlefield dispatches and cultural artifacts. Each Primarch is represented as a node of both symbolic and tactical significance, associated with unique traits that influenced the conduct of their legions and shaped the wider campaign. Famous leaders of the Crusade can be grouped into two categories: the central architect of the campaign and the Primarchs who executed his design. The architect is described in the records as a visionary who combined strategic foresight with technical mastery. He is credited in preserved Mechanicus files with the creation of the augmented warrior legions and the infrastructure to sustain them. The Primarchs, 20 in original number, though not all survived the early centuries, each embodied distinct approaches to war and governance. Battle records emphasize their individuality. One might specialize in siegecraft, another in rapid armored assaults, a third in fleet operations. Their legions mirrored these traits, developing tactics and cultures that reflected the temperaments of their Primarch commanders. Administrative dispatches describe this system as both effective and precarious, since it allowed immense flexibility in the field but risked divergence in ethos. Individual legions produced units that acquired reputations extending beyond their immediate tactical role. Among these, certain first companies are repeatedly referenced in battle annals as exemplars of discipline and execution. The veteran cadres within these companies were often deployed at the vanguard of assaults or as shock troops to breach defences. Records of the Lunar Wolves, later renamed, emphasise their disciplined spearhead formations and the role of their first company in setting the standard for the Legion's wider operations. Other legions maintained specialist units, such as dedicated Terminator contingents, armed in heavy tactical dreadnought armour. The armour, a prototype during the Crusade, granted extreme protection and the ability to breach fortifications, though at the cost of mobility. Its appearance in the record is a marker of elite status, as only the most veteran warriors were granted its use. The war machines of the Crusade represent another dimension of fame and recognition. The most iconic are the Titans, towering engines of war maintained by the Mechanicum Titan legions. Standing dozens of meters tall, these constructs were not merely battlefield tools but mobile symbols of the Crusade's might. Their presence on campaign was often commemorated in civic monuments. Fragments of bas-relief show Titans striding across shattered landscapes, with infantry arrayed at their feet. Battlefield logs list their weapons by category: plasma annihilators, quake cannons, and volcano cannons among them. Deployment records suggest they were rarely fielded in isolation, instead supported by combined arms formations of infantry, armoured vehicles, and aerospace assets. Their operational role was to overwhelm entrenched resistance or obliterate hostile war engines, creating breakthroughs where conventional forces might falter. Smaller war machines, though less monumental, were equally integral. The Land Raider, introduced during the Crusade, exemplifies this category. With layered ceramite armour and a combination of transport capacity and heavy weapons, it allowed augmented warriors to advance directly into the thick of battle. Recovered schematics emphasise its modular design, permitting adaptation to varied environments. The Predator tank, Rhino transport, and Sicaran battle tank all appear in Crusade inventories, each with a specific doctrinal role: fire support, troop delivery, or rapid flanking maneuvers. Together, these vehicles created an ecosystem of mechanized warfare that distinguished the Crusade from prior, more fragmented human conflicts. Beyond the machines, the behavioral instincts of the legions themselves are visible in comparative analysis of campaign reports. Legionaries are consistently described as demonstrating relentless discipline, a tendency toward aggression tempered by rigid chains of command. They were engineered for endurance, with accounts emphasizing their ability to sustain weeks of combat with minimal respite. Their instincts leaned toward decisive engagement. Once ordered to strike, they pursued objectives with little regard for personal survival. Administrative observers sometimes note that their zeal required careful control by primarchs and officers to prevent overextension. This instinctive drive was reinforced through training, genetic enhancement, and the rituals embedded in Legion culture. Rituals served both practical and symbolic purposes. Oath-taking before battle, weapon maintenance performed as a collective liturgy, and initiation rites for new recruits are recorded in Legion archives. For instance, certain legions practiced the engraving of battle honours on armour plates, creating a physical record of service. Others observed rituals of remembrance for fallen comrades, codified into their deployment routines. The repetition of these practices instilled cohesion and reinforced loyalty to the Legion and Primarch. While the specifics varied, the underlying pattern reveals a culture in which ritual was inseparable from operational discipline. Ethics within the legions were defined less by abstract philosophy and more by functional codes of conduct. Field manuals stress obedience, loyalty, and efficiency as paramount virtues. Mercy toward enemies is rarely recorded. Rather, compliance with strategic objectives is the consistent ethical metric. At the same time, records show that internal codes discouraged unnecessary cruelty or waste of resources. This balance reflects an ethic rooted in pragmatism. Actions were judged by their contribution to the Crusade's goals, rather than by universal moral principles. Some legions, however, developed reputations for harsher interpretations, applying discipline with extremity or embracing attrition as a matter of doctrine. These divergences hint at the potential for later fractures once central control weakened. Internal divisions within the augmented warrior castes are documented in training and command structures. Veterans formed the core of first companies and elite formations, while neophytes underwent prolonged probationary periods under the supervision of experienced officers. Ranks within the legions extended beyond simple battlefield command, incorporating roles such as chaplains, responsible for morale and ritual, and librarians, who combined martial skill with psychic discipline. This internal stratification created a society within the legions with its own values, honours, and penalties. Although designed to operate as unified machines of war, they functioned as microcosms of order, each with internal hierarchies, traditions, and conflicts. Civilian divisions within the Crusade's broader social structure also reveal stratification. Planetary governors, military administrators, Mechanicus Magi, and civilian labour guilds all occupied distinct niches within the larger framework. Archaeological evidence from integration-era worlds shows new districts built to house incoming administrators, often in close proximity to garrison fortresses. These districts represent the physical embodiment of the internal castes that developed within the expanding polity. Civic hierarchies mirrored military ones. Governors held authority but answered to the Crusade's central command, while local populations found themselves reclassified into roles of labour, conscription, or logistical support. This system, while effective in maintaining control, also introduced tensions that would surface more clearly in the centuries following the Crusade's conclusion. In summation, the Great Crusade's famous leaders, units, and war machines cannot be considered in isolation from the behavioural instincts, rituals, ethics, and divisions that defined them. The Primarchs exemplified the individuality and charisma that directed vast legions. The units under them embodied traditions and specialised roles that made them legendary. The war machines, from titans to transports, expressed the technological and industrial base of the Crusade, functioning as both tools and symbols. The behavioural instincts and rituals of the warriors sustained cohesion and discipline, while the ethical codes and internal divisions ensured both function and hierarchy. Together, these elements created a complex tapestry of martial culture that powered the expansion, leaving behind not only monuments and ruins, but also a legacy of order and fracture that would shape subsequent centuries of history. The surviving documentation of the Great Crusade preserved within the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus is immense, though far from complete. It is often remarked that for every record that has survived, 1,000 more have been lost, destroyed, or sealed in restricted archives. Yet from what can be assembled, the picture that emerges is one of an undertaking of such scale that even the most hardened of imperial logisticians struggle to capture its breadth. The campaign was not merely a military offensive, it was a restructuring of the galaxy, planned and executed with a precision that blended administrative rigor, technological innovation, and sheer martial force. The Adeptus Administratum, whose later existence was shaped directly by the demands of this era, has left accounts that are dry, measured, and numerical. They speak of the movement of populations, the levying of soldiers, and the flow of resources from system to system. They describe how the Imperium's expansion required the census of newly discovered worlds, the categorization of their populations, and the assignment of obligations to the growing machinery of the Imperium. Every planet brought into compliance was assessed for tithe value, not merely in terms of material production, but in potential manpower, navigational position, and suitability for long-term integration. The Adeptus Mechanicus, by contrast, maintained its own documentation in the form of technical schemata, inventories, and reports of standard template construct fragment rediscovery. Their focus lay in the machinery that enabled the Crusade to function. They recorded the yield of plasma reactors, the transport capacity of colossal starships, the availability of replacement parts for power armor, and the sacred rituals of maintenance that kept the ancient engines of war operational. They viewed the Great Crusade not as a conquest in itself, but as a grand demonstration of the machine god's will, with every recovered piece of lost technology serving as a holy vindication of their pact with the Emperor. The logistical demands of the Great Crusade defy easy quantification. Entire fleets were required simply to transport food, raw materials and supplies to sustain expeditionary forces that could number in the millions. The Administratum calculated the caloric intake of human soldiers, the energy requirements of armoured vehicles, and the replacement rates of weapons lost to combat or wear. Each advance into unknown space stretched supply lines further, requiring careful coordination between staging worlds and resupply fleets. Even the most disciplined legion of Space Marines could not survive indefinitely without the infrastructure that shadowed their movements. Mechanicus archives reveal the scale of industrial commitment demanded. Forge worlds were tasked with producing war material at levels never before seen. Titan legions were deployed as symbols of overwhelming power, but each god machine required thousands of adepts and servitors to maintain, each Titan demanding rare materials and advanced knowledge for continued operation. The Mechanicum measured success not only in victories won, but in the successful preservation and replication of technological processes that had once been thought irretrievably lost. Administratum records detail how populations were displaced or restructured in the process of conquest. On compliant worlds, populations were reorganized into labor divisions, with census takers ensuring that every individual was accounted for in the Imperium's grand ledger. On non-compliant worlds, Administratum reports speak clinically of casualties, exterminations, or forced relocations. For them, these were figures on parchment, though the reality was the erasure of entire cultures. The Administratum's language was deliberately detached, reducing the trauma of conquest into columns of figures and percentage losses, a tone that persists in their records to this day. Mechanics Analytics described the Crusade as an experiment in technological endurance. They documented the wear rates of void shields exposed to constant warfare, the survivability of different marks of power armor, and the efficiency of fuel systems for armored vehicles under different planetary conditions. Data was cross-referenced and stored, much of it forming the basis of later standard template construct reconstructions. What the warriors of the Great Crusade may have experienced as hardship, the Mechanicus recorded as measurable variables, seeking to perfect the machine through trial and error. The coordination between the Administratum and Mechanicus during the Crusade is perhaps most clearly visible in the realm of transportation. The sheer distances involved necessitated fleets of staggering size. Administratum reports detailed schedules of deployment, estimated arrival times across hundreds of light years, and the staggering complexity of charting new warp routes. The Mechanicus provided the ships themselves, venerable vessels whose machine spirits had sailed the stars for millennia. Each ship was a miracle of endurance, and their continued operation required the devotion of entire crews of tech priests. The scale of record-keeping also reveals the hierarchy of values within the imperial bureaucracy. Administratum ledgers emphasize human manpower, agricultural potential, and taxation. Mechanicus schemata prioritize technological relics, manufactoria, and the rediscovery of archaeotech. Both institutions, however, converged on a single truth. The Great Crusade was impossible without the careful alignment of flesh and steel. Some of the most remarkable records are those that attempt to capture the overall scale of the effort numerically. Administratum estimates of the number of soldiers under arms at any given time range in the hundreds of millions, with tens of millions of support personnel required to sustain them. Space Marine legions, though numerically small compared to the massive Imperial Army regiments, were recorded with obsessive attention to detail, each legion tracked down to its companies, fleets, and campaigns. Mechanicus reports detail how the Forge world shifted from localized production to a galaxy-spanning network of resource allocation, each world bound into the Crusade's supply web like a cog in a grand engine. The reports also note the challenges of attrition. Administratum tallies recorded how entire regiments were consumed in battles of compliance, requiring constant levies from new worlds to replace them. The Mechanicus documented the loss of irreplaceable machines, some of which had been preserved from the dark age of technology, now destroyed in the fires of war. Both institutions reveal in their records a growing awareness that the Crusade was not merely a campaign with an endpoint, but a cycle of conquest and consumption that might continue indefinitely. It is significant that neither the Administratum nor the Mechanicus speak at length about the moral dimension of the Crusade. For the Administratum, the loss of life was accounted for in quotas, with little commentary beyond the numbers themselves. For the Mechanicus, destruction was regrettable only when it meant the loss of technological relics. Both institutions reflected a detached, almost clinical viewpoint, which preserved the records for future study but erased much of the human experience. The quantitative details that survive, however, remain invaluable for modern historians. They allow for the reconstruction of supply lines, fleet compositions, and industrial output with far greater precision than oral or legendary accounts. The Administratum's endless scrolls and the Mechanicus's data stack stand as complementary records, offering two angles of observation, one concerned with people, the other with machines, but both indispensable in understanding how the Great Crusade functioned as a galactic project. For the Adeptus Administratum, the Crusade was the defining moment that shaped their institution. Their obsession with census, tithe, and logistics originated in the overwhelming need to manage a galaxy in flux. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, it was the proving ground of their alliance with the Emperor, where their sacred technologies were tested in the crucible of war, and where their monopoly on the machinery of conquest was solidified. Together, their records form the most enduring testimony to the vast machinery of the Great Crusade, a machinery whose echoes still define the Imperium today. The record of the Great Crusade is dominated by accounts of compliance actions, campaigns, and wars fought across every conceivable environment of the galaxy. The Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus preserved only fragments of the total number, but those fragments provide enough to illustrate both the variety of conflict encountered and the evolving style of warfare that characterized the Imperial advance. These reports rarely linger on emotional heroism. Instead, they describe engagements in measured terms, focusing on strategic objectives, tactical execution, and material consequences. From these accounts, certain campaigns stand out, not because they were unique in scope, but because they revealed critical patterns in how the Imperium imposed compliance and how its armies adapted to the resistance of alien civilizations and independent human polities. The first decades of the Great Crusade saw a preponderance of engagements against isolated human worlds, cut off since the Age of Strife. Administratum reports describe these early campaigns as efficient, often resolved through the demonstration of overwhelming force. The presence of a Legion fleet in orbit, the landing of a few companies of Space Marines, and the display of advanced Imperial technology were often sufficient to bring planetary rulers into submission. These early victories created a perception within the bureaucracy that compliance would be swift across most of the galaxy. However, as the Crusade expanded into more densely populated regions, the scale and ferocity of resistance increased dramatically. Among the most cited conflicts in early Mechanicus archives is the compliance of the planet Zenobia. Here, the Emperor's forces encountered an advanced human society that had preserved fragments of Dark Age technology. The battle is described in meticulous terms by tech priests who examined the ruins afterward. They noted the defensive emplacements powered by fusion reactors, the deployment of armoured walkers of unfamiliar design, and the presence of gravitic weaponry that inflicted severe losses on the initial waves of Imperial Army troops. The records state that it was only through the direct intervention of the Lunar Wolves, operating under the command of Horus, that the planet was subdued. Administratum reports calculated casualty rates in the tens of thousands, but the recovery of intact archaeotech was deemed sufficient justification for the losses. The Zenobia campaign established a precedent. Resistance would not always collapse at the sight of Imperial power, and in such cases the legions would be required to enforce compliance with decisive violence. A different style of conflict was recorded during the compliance of the Ulanor system. Administratum tallies of the campaign describe sustained warfare against vast orc populations. Unlike human worlds, which could often be subdued through political negotiation or limited shows of force, the orcs resisted until extermination. The Ulanor campaign became the most famous of its kind during the Crusade, culminating in a grand triumph in which Horus was named War Master. Administratum records of Ulanor emphasize the scale of the logistics involved. Millions of soldiers deployed, vast supplies of munitions expended, and the total annihilation of countless orc settlements. Mechanicus records focus on the wear inflicted on Titan legions, and the strain placed on void warships during prolonged planetary bombardment. The campaign was a demonstration of Imperial power on a scale intended to discourage further rebellion, and its documentation reflects the Empire's intent to display overwhelming might as a deterrent as much as a practical necessity. Other campaigns demonstrate the adaptability of Imperial forces to unusual conditions. Reports of the compliance of the Diasporex describe a nomadic human civilization that had formed an alliance with alien species, dwelling aboard fleets of starships rather than settled planets. Administratum records treat the Diasporex as a logistical anomaly, noting the difficulty in categorizing a population that had no homeworld, no fixed tithe value, and no centralized political structure. Mechanicus archives describe the fleets themselves in great detail, noting the hybridization of human and Xenos technology in the design of their vessels. The conflict required sustained fleet actions in deep space, testing the endurance of Imperial naval power. Battle reports speak of void engagements lasting weeks, with Imperial vessels pressing their advantage through superior coordination and the deployment of Legion boarding parties. The eventual destruction of the Diasporex fleet is recorded as an inevitability, but the records reveal that this inevitability was achieved only through costly attrition. The fighting style of the Imperial legions is revealed most clearly in such records. Administratum reports emphasize their role as shock troops, deployed at the point of greatest resistance. The standard Imperial Army regiments would fix the enemy in place, while the legions delivered decisive strikes at critical locations. Mechanicus accounts describe the technical aspects of their equipment and battlefield deployment. They recorded the performance of different marks of power armor under fire, the reliability of bolter ammunition, and the efficiency of drop pod deployments. These details reveal how the legions were evaluated as much for their role in battle as for their function as data sources in the ongoing refinement of war gear. Another significant conflict preserved in both Administratum and Mechanicus records is the compliance of the Interrex. Administratum records note that this was initially approached as a diplomatic effort, given that the Interrex were human and possessed advanced culture and technology. Mechanicus schemata reveal an intense interest in the Interrex's weaponry, particularly their Kylo blades and advanced anti-chaos defences. The battle that followed is recorded as a catastrophic breakdown of negotiations, resulting in violent clashes between the Lunar Wolves and the Interrex military. Administratum reports list the engagement as a tragic but necessary compliance, though their language suggests that this was one of the few times during the Crusade when full-scale war might have been avoided. Mechanicus records, however, note the loss of potential technological exchanges with particular regret. In terms of battle details, Administratum accounts often record campaigns in terms of percentages. They report, for example, the estimated reduction of hostile populations after bombardment, the proportion of regiments surviving after compliance, and the tonnage of material expended. These figures are clinical, but they reveal the enormous attrition required to bring entire sectors under imperial rule. Mechanicus records, conversely, provide measurements of war machines in action. They note the endurance of Titans during prolonged assaults, the survival rates of different classes of tanks in varied terrain, and the structural damage sustained by void ships after repeated warp jumps into contested systems. The fighting style of the Imperium during the Great Crusade was therefore characterized by overwhelming application of force, supported by precise logistical calculation. Administratum analysts describe how the legions were rarely used for prolonged attritional warfare, as this would have wasted their genetic potential. Instead, they were committed to rapid strikes at command centers, planetary capitals, or industrial hubs. Once these objectives were secured, the Imperial Army and supporting forces would pacify the broader population. This combination of surgical strikes and mass mobilization created a rhythm of conquest that was replicated across thousands of worlds. Some records also capture the limits of this strategy. During the compliance of the Rangdan Xenocides, Administratum and Mechanicus reports reveal the immense cost of fighting against hostile Xeno civilizations whose strength exceeded expectations. Casualty figures rose into the millions, entire fleets were reported destroyed, and Titan legions were lost beyond recovery. The Mechanicus noted severe strain on manufacturing capacity, while the Administratum recorded the near exhaustion of manpower reserves in several sectors. Though details remain fragmentary, these campaigns illustrate how the Crusade at times approached the edge of unsustainable consumption. The Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus did not, in their records, describe these campaigns as triumphs or tragedies. Instead, they reduced them to patterns of data. From their perspective, the notable battles of the Crusade were less about individual acts of heroism than about the demonstration of logistical and technological endurance. Every world brought into compliance was another data point in a vast equation, proving or disproving theories about the most efficient methods of conquest. The result was a form of warfare that was as much about the preservation of systemic function as it was about victory itself. In this way, the battles of the Great Crusade reveal the Imperium not simply as an empire of conquest, but as an empire of calculation. The Administratum's columns of numbers and the Mechanicus's schemata of machines capture the essential truth, that victory was achieved not only through strength of arms, but through the relentless machinery of record-keeping, supply, and technological preservation. The notable wars of the Crusade remain remembered not for their narrative qualities, but for the way they demonstrated the functioning of this machinery on a galactic scale. The surviving records of the Great Crusade are scattered across countless Administratum archives and Mechanicus data stacks, yet when assembled they reveal a near-endless series of conflicts beyond the most commonly cited campaigns. These lesser-known wars provide a clearer sense of the breadth of the undertaking. Each world represented unique conditions, requiring adaptation by Imperial forces, and each conflict produced reports that fed into the collective knowledge of how best to impose compliance on a galaxy resistant to unity. Administratum summaries often grouped these conflicts by type. Some campaigns were noted for their brevity, resolved in days or weeks through demonstrations of force or limited engagements. Others dragged on for years, requiring repeated waves of reinforcement and vast expenditures of material. Mechanicus records likewise categorized wars in terms of technological encounters. Where Xenos civilizations fielded unfamiliar weaponry, the Mechanicus recorded it with fascination, noting the tactical implications of energy-based artillery, gravitic propulsion, or bioengineered organisms. From their perspective, each battle was a laboratory of war, providing data for the refinement of Imperial armaments and doctrine. One such conflict was the compliance of the Corolli system. Administratum ledgers describe how the planetary population resisted Imperial integration through widespread insurgency rather than set-piece battles. Instead of organized armies, Imperial forces faced decentralized cells operating across urban zones and mountain ranges. The Administratum noted the difficulty of enforcing census and taxation in such an environment, while the Mechanicus reported the frequent sabotage of supply convoys and armoured columns. These records indicate that the eventual compliance of Corollis required a combination of extended occupation and targeted elimination of resistance leaders by the Space Marine detachments assigned. The campaign demonstrated the need for Imperial forces to adapt to guerrilla warfare, a form of conflict that could not be defeated through simple displays of overwhelming force. Another example preserved in fragmented Mechanicus schemata is the Battle for Zoros. Here, Imperial forces encountered a Xenos species whose primary weapons utilize sonic resonance to destabilize structures and disrupt human nervous systems. The records describe how standard armor and shielding proved ineffective against these attacks, leading to unusually high casualty rates in early engagements. Mechanicus data shows detailed analysis of the frequencies involved, resulting in modifications to Imperial equipment to counteract the effect. Administratum records note the eventual extermination of the Xenos species, but the language suggests that the campaign dragged on longer than anticipated, delaying subsequent Crusade movements in the sector. Administratum entries on the Helios compliance provide another view of protracted conquest. The Helios cluster contained multiple human-inhabited worlds with long-established interplanetary trade networks. Each world maintained its own political and military structures, and several resisted Imperial authority simultaneously. Administratum reports track the steady reduction of these polities through coordinated sieges and blockades. The Mechanicus documents from Helios focus less on the battles themselves and more on the recovery of advanced stellar cartography systems and navigation technology, which they quickly absorbed into their own archives. This dual record shows how military conquest and technological recovery were treated as parallel goals, each equally important to the long-term progress of the Crusade. The Administratum's description of the aftermath of such wars is notable for its emphasis on reorganization. Once compliance was declared, the immediate focus shifted to census, tithe assessment, and integration into the Imperial structure. Reports list population numbers, agricultural yield, mineral resources, and the number of recruits eligible for military service. The language is detached, yet it demonstrates how every victory was immediately translated into quantifiable contributions to the Imperium. The Mechanicus likewise produced aftermath records, though theirs focused on cataloguing captured technology, securing manufactoria, and establishing maintenance cults to ensure the long-term function of infrastructure. These aftermath reports reveal how the Imperium treated conquest not as an endpoint, but as the beginning of systemic integration. A campaign that illustrates this transition is the compliance of the Thonia subsectors surrounding the Legion's recruitment world. Administratum records emphasize the establishment of mining quotas and workforce redistribution after Imperial control was imposed. Mechanicus documents detail the evaluation of extraction technologies and the rapid construction of orbital infrastructure to feed resources directly into the wider Crusade. The aftermath of Chthonia's surrounding systems demonstrates the efficiency with which conquered populations were assimilated into the logistics of expansion. There are also records of campaigns where aftermath took the form of annihilation rather than integration. Administratum reports of the genocide of the Diasporex make clear that no census or tithe assessment was conducted, since the civilization no longer existed to contribute. Instead, the aftermath was described in terms of void debris, the scattering of surviving populations, and the elimination of navigational anomalies caused by their fleets. Mechanicus reports from this campaign detail the salvaging of hybridized technologies from the wreckage, but note that much of it was too unstable for replication. In such cases, the aftermath consisted of erasure, with the Imperium imposing its order through absence rather than assimilation. The broader analytical reports compiled by both the Administratum and Mechanicus reveal patterns in these additional wars. Administratum analysts calculated average casualty rates for compliance campaigns, noting that human civilizations tended to surrender after sustaining 20 to 30% losses, while Xenos civilizations frequently fought until near total destruction. Mechanicus data identified recurring challenges in maintaining war machines under constant deployment. Plasma reactors required recalibration after extended campaigns, void shields degraded under sustained bombardment, and Titan legions demanded levels of maintenance that exceeded local capacity, requiring rotation back to Forge worlds. These findings became institutional knowledge, shaping the way the Imperium managed warfare across thousands of campaigns. The aftermath of the Great Crusade is also recorded in aggregate terms. Administratum estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of worlds were brought into compliance, though the exact figure is uncertain. They calculated population increases in the billions absorbed into the Imperium's system of taxation and recruitment. Mechanicus records, on the other hand, emphasize the immense increase in technological assets, the recovery of standard template construct fragments, the expansion of shipyards, and the reinforcement of Forge world dominance within the growing Imperium. Both perspectives converge on the conclusion that the Crusade permanently altered the scale and capacity of the human empire, transforming it into a structure capable of sustaining itself on a galactic level. Yet both Administratum and Mechanicus records also hint at the strains imposed by the Crusade. Administratum summaries speak of manpower shortages in certain regions, caused by overextension of military commitments. Mechanicus logs reveal critical bottlenecks in the production of void ships, replacement titans, and power armor. These strains were not fatal to the Crusade, but they demonstrated that the machinery of conquest was not limitless. The aftermath of each campaign was not only integration, but also the recalibration of resources to ensure that the advance could continue. In their final analytical reports, both institutions reached similar conclusions. The Adeptus Administratum described the Crusade as the most complex logistical project in human history, a project whose success lay in the careful balance between conquest and integration. The Adeptus Mechanicus described it as a technological proving ground, in which the machine god's relics were tested, preserved, and expanded across the galaxy. Neither institution recorded the Crusade in moral or ideological terms. For them, its aftermath was not measured in triumph or tragedy, but in population numbers, resource flows, and machine endurance. Thus, the additional wars of the Great Crusade, though often overshadowed by more famous battles, provide the clearest sense of its ongoing rhythm. Each compliance, whether achieved through negotiation, attrition, or annihilation, fed into the endless cycle of conquest and assimilation. Each aftermath, whether census or erasure, became another entry in the archives of a bureaucracy and a cult of technology that sought not to tell stories, but to preserve data. In these records, the Great Crusade is revealed not as a singular event, but as the systematic construction of an empire, whose true measure was not in the victories won, but in the machinery that endured long after the battles themselves were forgotten. The Inquisition, established long after the conclusion of the Great Crusade, inherited not only the fragmented records of those tumultuous centuries, but also the enduring mystery that accompanied them. In reviewing these preserved accounts, inquisitors of the Order Historicus, the Order Malleus, and the Order Hereticus alike came to recognize that the Great Crusade cannot be understood solely as a military expansion. It was also a period of profound distortions, unexplained phenomena, and contradictions that elude rational explanation. What follows is not a straightforward chronicle of campaigns, but an assessment of impressions gathered from multiple sources, some verified, others conjectural, and still others obscured behind deliberate censorship. From the outset, one observation recurs with striking regularity: the near unnatural cohesion of the Imperium's expansion under the Emperor's direct command, to chart the stars, unify thousands of cultures, and establish dominion across entire sectors within mere centuries should, by any rational measure, have required millennia. Even factoring in the deployment of the Primarchs and their legions, supported by the might of the Mechanicum and the sheer bureaucracy of the Administratum, the scale remains improbable. Many inquisitors note the almost surgical precision by which the Crusade advanced, suggesting influences beyond mortal calculation. Whether this was a reflection of the Emperor's unparalleled foresight or something less easily defined remains a matter of speculation. A recurring anomaly appears in the fragmented logs of the Legiones Astartes. Certain campaigns are recorded as lasting decades in one set of archives, while cross-reference Mechanicum data suggests they concluded within years, sometimes even months. These discrepancies, while often attributed to warp time dilation, display patterns inconsistent with typical navigational anomalies. Some reports describe fleets arriving at locations centuries before reinforcement waves that had left Terra earlier. Inquisitorial analysts struggle to reconcile how command structures functioned amid these temporal fractures, and yet, remarkably, orders were carried out with remarkable precision. Whether this was due to foresight, manipulation of the warp, or suppression of conflicting records remains unresolved. Inquisitorial observers also note the peculiar absence of failure in the Primarchs' campaigns during the earlier stages of the Crusade. Though there were costly engagements, reversals, and drawn-out wars, there are few outright defeats recorded in the earlier century of expansion. This phenomenon led some within the Ordo Historicus to theorize that the Emperor possessed either an uncanny mastery of probability or some prescient ability to steer events toward victory. More controversial theories posit that some records of failure were deliberately erased, either by the Emperor himself, his custodians, or later by the Administratum and Mechanicus at his command. What is left is a curated narrative of inevitable triumph, one which served the unifying myth of an invincible Imperium. Another observation arises in the matter of human compliance. The sheer variety of human societies encountered, ranging from advanced interstellar federations to regressed feral worlds, should have presented insurmountable difficulties in integration. Yet again and again, compliance was achieved with uncanny regularity, often through displays of overwhelming force, but sometimes through diplomacy and persuasion. Inquisitorial historians find it notable how frequently populations not only submitted but adapted swiftly to imperial doctrine, often adopting the Imperial Truth within a single generation. Such accelerated ideological conformity raises the question of whether unseen influences were at play, perhaps subtle manipulation of thought, mass psychic reinforcement, or even the Emperor's direct imposition of his will upon entire planetary populations. The question of the Primarchs themselves provides further material for inquisitorial unease. Their sudden rediscovery, one by one, across vast swathes of the galaxy, displays improbability bordering on impossibility. The warp storms that had isolated humanity for millennia dissipated just as the Great Crusade commenced, clearing navigational paths as if by design. The discovery of each Primarch occurred in circumstances so improbably coincidental that even the most cautious inquisitors whisper of orchestration beyond mortal comprehension. That the Primarchs were always found alive, thriving, and in positions of leadership on their respective worlds further defies chance. Unexplainable reports also emerge from the Mechanicum's archives concerning technologies encountered during the Crusade. Entire civilizations were discovered wielding technologies equal to or beyond the Mechanicum's mastery, yet in most cases such artifacts vanished from the record soon after compliance. Inquisitorial investigation suggests systematic suppression of such discoveries, with the Emperor himself or his closest agents ensuring that no alternative technological tradition threatened the Mechanicum's monopoly. On rare occasions where fragments of such data remain, references are made to weapons capable of destabilizing planetary crusts with surgical precision, or to void shielding systems resistant to energies not understood even in the 41st millennium. Where these artifacts went, and why they were erased from the official annals, is a matter the Inquisition continues to dispute. The ethical dimensions of the Great Crusade also weigh heavily in inquisitorial records. From an observational standpoint, the Imperial Truth was imposed with a severity bordering on dogma, yet one which paradoxically rejected dogma itself. Inquisitorial scholars note the strange irony of a unifying creed that denied the existence of gods, while itself being enforced with the zeal of a religion. Many worlds embraced the truth, but many more resisted, sometimes to extinction. Inquisitorial observers remain troubled by the ferocity with which cultural identity was suppressed, often by erasure, purging, or the destruction of knowledge deemed contrary to imperial unity. In retrospect, such eradication may have contributed to the rise of later heresies, for suppressed belief often persists in shadow, waiting to resurface. Perhaps the most disturbing category of inquisitorial observation concerns reports of phenomena not easily rationalized within the framework of materialist imperial doctrine. Isolated references exist to apparitions on the battlefield, unexplained voices heard by Astartes captains in the heat of war, or sudden and inexplicable shifts in morale among enemy populations, entire armies surrendering without cause, cities opening their gates seemingly without coercion. Though officially dismissed as exaggeration, the consistency of these reports across unrelated sources troubles inquisitors. Some conclude that the Emperor's psychic will was far more actively imposed than official histories admit, shaping outcomes invisibly while the Crusade maintained the facade of rationalist expansion. One particularly enigmatic set of records emerges from the Ulanor campaign. While the victory is recorded as a defining moment of imperial triumph, certain suppressed Mechanicum data describes energy readings unlike any previously encountered. These signatures, neither purely warp-based nor entirely material, coincided with the mass withdrawal of Orc forces. Inquisitorial speculation suggests that Ulanor was not merely a battlefield, but the site of a deeper, possibly ancient phenomenon triggered by the Emperor's presence. The nature of this phenomenon remains beyond categorization, with sealed reports classifying it as both a tactical anomaly and a metaphysical event. The final impression left in inquisitorial analyses of the Great Crusade is one of duality. On the surface, it was a period of triumph, expansion, and the creation of order out of galactic chaos. Beneath this narrative, however, run currents of secrecy, anomalies, and inexplicable events. It is as if the Crusade was not merely the reclamation of human space, but the stage setting for something greater, perhaps even something the Emperor foresaw but did not, or could not, share with his followers. For the Inquisition, these unanswered questions serve as both a warning and a compulsion, a reminder that even the most triumphant histories may conceal deeper mysteries. The Great Crusade, then, is not merely a chapter in the Imperium's past. It is a shadowed mirror reflecting both glory and unease. Its victories inspire, but its anomalies unsettle, for they point to truths too vast or too dangerous to be recorded openly. The Inquisition's role, as ever, is to preserve, investigate, and where necessary, conceal. In the case of the Great Crusade, concealment has proven to be the dominant approach, for what lies beneath its official accounts threatens to unravel the myth of imperial inevitability. The Great Crusade produced an archive of campaigns vast enough to overwhelm even the most diligent scholars. Yet buried within the carefully curated histories are fragments, discrepancies, and suppressed reports that resist integration into the triumphant narrative. These anomalies, sometimes subtle, sometimes catastrophic, have been preserved in sealed records accessed only by the highest authorities of the Inquisition. Each case reflects not only the chaos of a galaxy in flux, but also the presence of forces that elude material explanation. One of the earliest documented anomalies occurred during the compliance of the Carpathian Cluster. The official record describes the swift subjugation of 9 human-inhabited systems through coordinated fleet actions by the Imperial Fists and their auxiliary elements, yet suppressed Mechanicum telemetry contradicts the published accounts. Orbital scans reveal that entire continents on 2 of the cluster's worlds became uninhabitable in a matter of hours. Their atmospheres boiled away with no signs of bombardment or seismic weaponry. Survivors described the sky itself tearing apart, followed by silence. To this day, the sealed files classify the cause as an environmental destabilization event, though inquisitorial review suggests it was something less natural. A rare note appended to the file speculates about Xenos interference or uncontrolled psychic resonance, but no culprit was ever identified. Another case emerges from the campaigns of the Lunar Wolves during their assault on the Agoru system. Publicly, this is recorded as a simple compliance action, wherein the 16th Legion pacified a primitive society. The sealed reports, however, tell a different story. Legionaries describe structures of impossible geometry, rising and collapsing within the jungle depths, vanishing as if phantoms when approached. Entire squads reported voices directing them to halt or withdraw, often echoing in languages they did not know but understood instinctively. When the Emperor himself arrived to oversee the final compliance, these phenomena ceased immediately, and no further anomalies were reported. The surviving Agoru population was exterminated shortly afterward, with no reason given in the public record. The Great Crusade remains the most well-known anomaly, though the sanitized version omits critical details. While the official account describes a great triumph against the Orcs, the sealed Mechanicum logs capture energy readings inconsistent with any known weapon discharge. Witnesses recorded atmospheric disturbances manifesting as aurora-like waves visible across the battlefield, coinciding with the sudden mass rout of Orc forces. Entire warbands dropped their weapons, retreating without provocation or visible command. Orc psychology has never shown susceptibility to mass fear, yet the Ulanor Orcs scattered as if struck by an invisible weapon. A sealed transcript mentions intervention by unknown agency, but provides no further clarification. Some inquisitors speculate that the Emperor employed a form of psychic force, not reproducible by any of his sons or successors. Others argue Ulanor concealed a deeper pre-imperial secret that was triggered during the campaign. A series of disturbing anomalies also surround the Rangdan genocides. Much of the detail has been erased from official records, with even the identity of the Xenos race obscured by censorship. Yet inquisitorial archives retain fragments suggesting the Rangdan possessed weapons that interacted with time itself. Battle reports note Imperial ships destroyed before enemy fire could have reached them, as if struck retroactively. There are also accounts of Imperial commanders issuing orders that their subordinates swore had already been given hours earlier. In some instances, entire regiments vanished, only to reappear weeks later with no memory of their absence. The files are sealed under the highest levels of inquisitorial classification, with multiple cross-references to forbidden research into temporal mechanics. Another disturbing record comes from the Istvanian rebellion of the 33rd century of the Crusade. This revolt is remembered in official histories as a minor planetary uprising, but sealed administratum files note that Imperial forces encountered resistance from troops identical in appearance, weaponry, and heraldry to their own. These mirror legions fought with uncanny precision, anticipating every maneuver as though forewarned. The rebellion was crushed only after a detachment of the Blood Angels spearheaded a counter-offensive, but survivors reported killing enemies who bore their own faces, complete with matching scars and augmetics. The Mechanicum designated the event a clonal insurgency, but the genetic material recovered bore no traces of artificial origin. Instead, the samples matched precisely to the loyalist warriors who had fought them. No explanation was ever offered, and the rebellion's records were sealed indefinitely. The genocide of the Diasporex is another campaign shrouded in contradictions. Officially, the Diasporex were a nomadic human Xenos confederacy, defeated by the Lunar Wolves and the Emperor's children. Yet ship logs from the battle show contradictory accounts of the Diasporex fleet's destruction. Several capital ships are recorded as destroyed multiple times in separate locations. Vox transcripts from Imperial vessels detail sightings of the same ship, fighting in 3 different engagements simultaneously. The Mechanicum attempted to dismiss these errors as misfiled records, but the scale and consistency of the duplication remained too precise to attribute to clerical error. The sealed reports instead classify the diasporics as entities of indeterminate dimensional status, suggesting their vessels may not have fully existed in real space. The compliance of 7319, a little-known industrial world in the Ghoul Stars, offers another enigmatic case. The Iron Hands were deployed to bring the planet into compliance, encountering resistance from its machine-governed ruling caste. Sealed records state that when the Legion breached the central hive complex, they discovered functioning human populations living in what appeared to be the past. Clothing, architecture, and technology matching old Earth in the Age of Terror's pre-unification period. The warriors attempted to make contact, but the moment the first exchange of words occurred, the entire environment collapsed into ruin. The legionaries later reported standing in abandoned, corroded ruins with no signs of life. The surviving reports were heavily redacted, and the planet was listed as compliant without further commentary. There are also disturbing sealed accounts from the compliance of Melchior, where the Death Guard encountered what should have been a primitive human population. Instead, the Legion faced warriors clad in archaic armor, bearing banners identical to those of the Death Guard themselves, but carrying heraldry associated with regiments from millennia in the future. Survivors noted that these warriors fought with unyielding discipline and displayed no fear of annihilation. The resemblance to Imperial troops was so striking that many Death Guard assumed they had been betrayed by another Imperial force. Later analysis of recovered war gear revealed construction methods centuries ahead of the Crusades era. All artifacts were seized by the Sigillites' agents and vanished into sealed vaults. Finally, there are scattered references to entire wars that appear in one archive but vanish entirely in others. Whole systems are named in early Crusade records, with compliance campaigns listed, yet later star maps contain no trace of their existence. The loss of records can be explained by bureaucratic error, yet the removal of stellar bodies themselves cannot. Some Ordo Historicus inquisitors speculate that the Great Crusade encountered phenomena capable of erasing civilizations, not merely from memory but from reality itself. These missing wars, now referred to in sealed files as Phantom Crusades, represent perhaps the most troubling anomaly of all: the possibility that the Imperium's own past is subject to alteration or erasure beyond its control. Taken together, these anomalies remind the Inquisition that the Great Crusade was not only a march of conquest, but also an engagement with forces unknown. The official narrative describes unity, triumph, and order imposed upon chaos, but the sealed reports tell another story, of shifting timelines, impossible foes, and unexplained interventions. Whether these represent the hidden hand of the Emperor, the interference of Xenos species now forgotten, or phenomena beyond the boundaries of the material universe, the truth remains concealed. For the Inquisition, the lesson is stark. The Great Crusade cannot be reduced to a simple tale of victory. It was also a confrontation with mysteries that persist into the 41st millennium, shadows that remain unresolved. These anomalies, locked away in sealed archives, serve as warnings that the Imperium's foundations are not as immutable as its histories claim. The archives of the Great Crusade contain volumes of official histories, sanitized for dissemination across the Imperium. These are the records studied by the Scholastica, preserved in libraries, and circulated among the officer class of the Astra Militarum. They speak of a golden march of conquest, guided by the Emperor and carried out by his sons. Yet alongside these records exists another layer of documentation, one not intended for public knowledge. These files are classified under the highest inquisitorial seals, restricted even from most members of the Ordos. They contain the observations, contradictions, and implications judged too dangerous to expose to the wider Imperium. Their contents reveal both the fragility and the uncertainty that underpinned the expansion of humanity in this era. The first category of classified material concerns the sheer scale of human loss during the Crusade. Official documents describe compliance actions as costly but manageable, always justified by the long-term stability they secured. The classified ledgers, however, present figures that tell a different story. Several campaigns resulted in the loss of entire expeditionary fleets, with no survivors to account for their fate. In certain cases, such as the campaigns into the Halo Stars, Administratum figures estimate that more than 10 million Imperial lives were expended with no compliant world gained. These records were sealed, not because they were unknown, but because to reveal such losses would undermine the image of the Emperor's unstoppable advance. The Inquisition, however, is forced to confront these numbers, recognizing the Crusade as not only a triumph, but also an era of unrelenting attrition. A second category of sealed documentation involves the methods of compliance. Public narratives describe negotiations or limited resistance, followed by orderly integration of worlds into the Imperium. Yet the most secure files reveal that numerous compliance systems were forcibly sterilized, their populations eradicated despite apparent willingness to submit. The justification for these actions varies. In some instances, suspected Xenos taint was cited. In others, the presence of psychic anomalies, and in others still the simple judgment that the population's culture was irreconcilable with imperial order. The extermination of the Agoru is one such example, where no evidence of heresy or Xenos presence was formally recorded, yet the world was purged following the Emperor's personal review. For the Inquisition, these actions provide an early precedent for the policy of extermination that continues into the 41st millennium. A further set of files deals with the role of the Primarchs themselves. The public record frames them as loyal sons, executing their father's will in unity. But classified memoranda from administratum auditors and mechanicus logisticians paint a more complicated picture. Numerous complaints were lodged regarding the independent tendencies of certain Primarchs, who not only reinterpreted the Emperor's commands but, in practice, established their own systems of governance within conquered territories. Angron's campaigns, for example, generated logistical collapse due to his disregard for infrastructure preservation. Perturabo's methods left compliant populations broken by sieges, unable to contribute meaningfully to the Imperium for centuries. Even Guilliman, celebrated for his discipline, was criticized for creating administrative frameworks that operated independently of Terra's oversight. While officially tolerated, these deviations from central control foreshadowed the fractures that would later erupt into civil war. Another category of classified reports involves weapons and technologies encountered during the Crusade and subsequently lost or destroyed. The Mechanicum kept extensive logs of Xenos war machines captured in the field. Some of these records note devices capable of displacing armoured cohorts instantly across kilometres, energy weapons leaving no material residue, and biological constructs immune to known chemical and physical damage. A recurring note across these files indicates the direct intervention of the Sigillites' agents, who ordered the immediate destruction or removal of such technologies. The official explanation given was that such devices represented corruption or instability incompatible with imperial systems. The sealed record, however, reveals a different rationale. Fear of destabilizing the Emperor's monopoly on technological control. The Inquisition concludes that the Crusade encountered many innovations beyond current imperial capability, but these were deliberately erased from use, cementing the stagnation that defines the Imperium's later history. Certain files focus on the Emperor himself. While the official narrative casts him as ever-present, guiding and overseeing, sealed documents acknowledge that his absence was more frequent than admitted. Some expeditionary fleets reported not seeing the Emperor or receiving his direct guidance for decades. Others noted unexplained appearances where the Emperor was reported in two distant campaigns within days of each other, a feat impossible without instantaneous travel. The Mechanicum recorded energy signatures consistent with psychic manifestations during these events, though these readings were themselves classified as heretical research. For the Inquisition, such inconsistencies point to mysteries surrounding the Emperor's methods, some of which remain unresolved even in the 41st millennium. Among the most troubling files are those concerning the disappearance of entire human populations during the Crusade. In multiple instances, compliant worlds that had sworn loyalty to Terra were revisited decades later, only to be found depopulated. No signs of conflict, famine, or disease were present. The cities stood intact, yet empty. The worlds of Carthage Minor, Erythrea Prime, and Obsidian's Reach were 3 such cases, each logged by separate fleets. In all cases, the Administratum listed the systems as barren but suitable for resettlement. The sealed records, however, preserve the testimonies of expeditionaries who claimed that upon arrival they heard voices echoing through abandoned streets, describing events from their own past campaigns. These testimonies were dismissed as unreliable, and the systems were repopulated under strict monitoring, but the anomalies remain unexplained. A distinct section of the classified archive is reserved for temporal inconsistencies. These files are marked with both administratum and inquisitorial seals, and their access is highly restricted. They describe instances where campaign records appear to contradict established chronology. Fleets arrive before they departed, worlds are listed as compliant decades before they were discovered, and commanders are recorded as deceased in one archive yet active in another. Attempts to reconcile these records result in paradoxes that no amount of clerical revision can fully resolve. The official solution was to standardize chronologies under a single Terran-approved timeline, but the classified documents preserve the contradictions. For the Inquisition, these temporal inconsistencies point to forces active during the Crusade that transcended conventional causality. As the classified files close, the Inquisition's final thoughts on the Great Crusade emerge with clarity. The era was a triumph of expansion, but its deeper record is marked by shadows and absences. The Imperium's growth was neither as seamless nor as unified as public histories suggest. Compliance was achieved at enormous cost, often through methods concealed from later generations. Technologies that could have altered humanity's destiny were suppressed, and phenomena that threatened rational explanation were buried beneath redaction. The Primarchs themselves, while instrumental, displayed early signs of division and autonomy that foreshadowed betrayal. The Inquisition concludes that the Great Crusade was not solely a march of victory, but also a period of controlled narrative. What is remembered has been curated to inspire loyalty. What is hidden remains too destabilizing to reveal. The sealed files reflect a dual reality, one of triumph and one of unresolved mystery. In the millennia since, the Imperium has endured precisely because the truth has been contained. Yet the Inquisition recognizes that the anomalies suppressed during the Crusade never truly vanished. They linger in the background of human history, threatening to resurface whenever control falters. Thus, the Inquisition's final assessment frames the Great Crusade as both the foundation of the Imperium and the beginning of its contradictions. It was an age of unparalleled conquest, but also of secrets deliberately entombed. For the Imperium of the 41st millennium, these lessons endure, that power is sustained not only by victories but also by silence, and that the greatest triumphs often conceal within them the seeds of later catastrophe.